I still remember the initial curiosity I felt back in 2017 when Marvel Entertainment released a trailer titled The Avengers Project. 2 years later, we received our first look at gameplay, and while some were satisfied, others felt a bit disappointed by what was shown. The gameplay reveal was met with criticism, mostly targeted towards the game's character models and voice acting. I myself was a bit underwhelmed, but I was still looking forward to the possibility of a single-player Avengers game, especially after the massive success of Insomniac's Spider-Man. But over the next year, as more and more info and gameplay was released, I began to become very concerned. I didn't mind the idea of being able to play the game online with random players or friends. It made sense, considering the Avengers are a team, but it became more apparent as time went on that the game's focus was not on its story, but rather a multiplayer grind system, where players drop into areas, button mash a bunch of robots and acquire some loot, very similar to the likes of Destiny and Anthem. After trying out the beta, I was certain that the single-player campaign would come across as an afterthought, and this would be another title plagued by microtransactions and a lack of content. After playing the game, most of my worries came true, but that being said, the game did have a few surprising and welcomed elements along the way. Marvel's Avengers picks up 5 years after a devastating event known as A-Day, where a terrorist attack was launched on a newly announced SHIELD helicarrier known as the Chimera, which held a special Terrigen crystal. This attack, which led to the apparent death of Captain America, as well as the destruction of the Chimera and a massive portion of San Francisco, was also responsible for transforming countless citizens into Inhumans, people with uncontrollable powers. The Avengers were blamed for the event, and as a result, disbanded. In the present, we find ourselves picking up the story as Kamala Khan, a young superfan of the Avengers who is present at the A-Day event. She herself has her own powers, and after discovering vital footage from the helicarrier on the day of the event, embarks on a journey to reassemble the Avengers and stop a growing threat. As I mentioned earlier, I had very low expectations for the game's story, especially after playing the open beta shortly before release. But I will admit, I was pleasantly surprised with the single-player campaign, mostly for the first 4 hours or so. Seeing everything through the lens of this young superfan was quite a joy to see. The feeling of wonder and awe when she first met the Avengers, I'm sure, is very similar to that of many fans, including myself when watching the movies for the first time. Kamala really surprised me as a protagonist, as I went into this game not expecting any heart, but her character without a doubt added a layer of this to the game's story. I especially loved her relationship with Bruce Banner, who comes across as her mentor in the story, but in the end, he ends up learning much from her as well. It was in the first few hours of the game's roughly 10-hour campaign, where you're exploring linear designed levels by yourself or with Bruce while trying to track down fellow Avengers, that I found myself most enjoying the story. The cast of Avengers mostly all benefit from good writing, including their classic witty banter, as well as solid voice acting from the cast. Standouts for me being Sandra Saad as the joyous, young Kamala Khan, and Troy Baker as an awkward and ashamed version of Bruce Banner after the A-Day event. The rest of the cast was solid for the most part. It was hard not to hear Nathan Drake and Nolan North's portrayal of Iron Man, and I found that the voice acting for Captain America sounded off and could get distracting at times, but overall, I feel as if the characters were done justice here. One of the aspects this game does very well is making it feel like the characters were well developed. When you meet up with them, they're all dealing with the events which happened in unique ways, which all felt tailored to their characters. Seeing them reunite, or in this case reassemble, and discuss where they stood was something I really liked, and it felt like there was depth and history between all of them. Eventually the campaign takes a turn for the worse, however, and completely changes its level design. For the first few hours, the ones that I enjoyed, the game has a very contained feel to it. It's not open world like Insomniac's Spider-Man, but rather straightforward and linear. The locations looked fairly good for the most part and had a lot of objects for characters to look at that added a small but welcomed amount of lore. There were even some small, albeit very basic puzzles. These involved very simple tasks, like pushing objects to hold your weight underneath a beam, punching buttons to move a pad, etc. Later on in the campaign, the levels merge with the multiplayer. Linear, well-designed levels are no more, and instead you're using the war table present in Online, where you drop into a location on the map. These locations virtually were all the same, the only difference being that the terrain may change from snow to sand. Otherwise, they all contain the same awkwardly placed metal boxes containing flashy lights, hundreds of tedious and annoying turrets, a bunch of boxes containing loot, and the most generically designed robots. It's a real shame that the campaign took this route. It honestly just feels lazy on the developer's part to take these well-designed levels that felt unique to the campaign, and then take a complete 180 and give us these generic rinse and repeat multiplayer maps. Even graphically, they're far weaker than the levels featured earlier in the story. Puzzles become almost non-existent besides a few really annoying, continuously punch this red flashing thing until it breaks moments. The story also sadly feels incredibly rushed, feeling like it skips over some of the later Avengers from having any real character moments together. Those heart-to-heart as well as argument sections were some of the best in not only the earlier parts of this game, but also in the movies. Once all of the Avengers are reassembled, you immediately head into the final mission to end the story. It felt like we were missing an entire third act. Instead, the finale is just awkwardly tossed in at the end of Act 2. The villains were pretty disappointing as well, as there were only 3 bosses in the campaign, 2 of which were literally featured in the beta. These boss fights, minus the last one, were incredibly lackluster and easy, and pretty much just boiled down to pressing square a bunch of times. It's a real shame that the campaign turned out this way, as in the earlier sections it showed a lot of promise with its heart and level design. But the second half of the game really hurts what could have been a really strong storyline. That being said, there are still some strong moments towards the end of the game, but overall, I left feeling like there was so much more potential. As I mentioned earlier, Avengers multiplayer consists of dropping into rinse and repeat locations where you will run around, grind for loot, and take down a bunch of repetitive enemies. It can be fun for the first while, especially when running around with friends as the Avengers, but this feeling only lasts for the first few hours, as there's a very limited amount of content to be found here. When you're in the main hubs that the game offers, you can approach various AI vendors who offer different gear, which you must complete a list of missions in order to acquire. Acquiring skins is done in a very similar way, where you unlock a mission chain that will require you to complete different tasks. The problem is that all of these quests take far too long to complete, and the reward is never fully worth it. One of the major issues with this game is the microtransactions. Certain skins that would take ridiculous amount of times to acquire in-game can also be obtained through purchasing them with real money. It's an annoying and outdated situation in the first place, but it's made even more ridiculous when you realize how high the prices are for some of these skins. It can cost you as much as $27 just to unlock one. This is incredibly greedy, especially for a game that costs full price at launch and isn't even fully complete, as this is a live service game that will be adding new content over the following years. Due to the repetitive missions, enemies, and locations, there's a lack of incentive to do these levels, as all you're rewarded with is gear which may slightly alter your stats, or skins which most of the time are just a different color. If the online offered more variety, then I wouldn't mind this nearly as much, but you can only visit a snowy tundra, Pacific Northwest forest, or barren canyons a few times before it grows very thin. For a game titled The Avengers, I was hoping to see way more iconic locations from the comics and movies, such as Asgard, Wakanda, or even New York City. Same can be said about the villains. Multiplayer consists of the same aim robots constantly being thrown at you. Where are characters like Loki, Doctor Doom, even Whiplash? I felt like if there were online missions that brought in these memorable locations and included villains from some of our favorite Avengers movies, the game would be much more exciting to play. As it stands, multiplayer is repetitive, uninteresting after short amounts of time, and plagued with matchmaking issues where you'll be waiting ridiculous amounts of time to play, only for the other player to be AFK. After the beta, I was really worried that the game was going to be made up of very repetitive button mashing. Luckily, the combat is actually a lot more fun. As you play more, you unlock skill points which can be used to unlock new attacks and combos. When you chain a bunch of these attacks together, it can be incredibly fun. I most enjoyed the playstyle of Kamala Khan, who can grow to large sizes and pick up enemies, tossing them around the room. Other characters like Captain America and Black Widow were a lot of fun to play with as well. I particularly like their faster, more agile movement style. Black Widow can grapple and pull herself towards enemies, and Cap can run on walls, although this is something that is rarely ever needed to be used. The flying characters like Iron Man and Thor felt fine for the most part. I liked Thor's hammer, as it reminded me a lot of Kratos and his axe in God of War, but Iron Man on the other hand felt a bit tedious to use. His melee attacks felt slower than everyone else, and you have to be pretty spot on with his repulsor blasts. The most useless character in my opinion, however, is Hulk. who deals the same amount of melee damage as Black Widow, something that, while makes sense for balancing issues, makes him feel incredibly underpowered. As far as abilities go, each character has 3. These abilities use both the left and right bumpers, also known as L1 and R1, or both at the same time, which uses a more powerful ability that takes longer to charge up. These are fun to use and can also be upgraded using skill points, which you gain from defeating enemies after completing missions. Sometimes when you're being overwhelmed with enemies, it's a bit difficult to chain together combos, as you'll die fairly quickly. This would often result in me button mashing to get out of these encounters. Certain mini-bosses, such as giant robots, required no thinking to take down and only consisted of standing in one spot and pressing the punch button with other players for 10 minutes. I don't have too much to say about gameplay. It worked for the most part besides a few minor issues along the way, but in the end, combat is a lot better than I was expecting it to be, and I had quite a bit of fun with it. Avengers is very simply put a messy game. Whether you're referring to the graphics, the HUD, or the performance, the game is plagued with issues. The earlier parts of the game looked good for the most part. The graphics weren't anything to write home about, but the game contained some decent lighting and details in the environments. I found myself enjoying the variety of locations you could visit, such as the Avengers convention, a graffitied and destroyed park that once contained statues of the heroes, and exploring the remains of a fallen helicarrier. They all felt well designed and were good locations and made for some fun set pieces. As I talked about earlier, however, the later maps in the campaign suffer from a major drop in quality. Textures are far poorer, ranging from plenty of pop-in textures to genuinely sad details such as the interiors of buildings or skylines in the distance. These maps contained virtually all of the same layouts with very minor differences, quite often the only major one being the terrain they featured. While I certainly had fun with the game's combat, the particle physics were heavily overdone, with way too many colors flying around the screen at once. Making this even worse is the numbers representing the damage you are dealing that drop from enemy health bars. The strange mix of colors made for some really odd choices that made the quality of the game seem significantly lower. I ultimately felt the same way about the game's HUD and UI, unnecessarily overstuffed and very reminiscent of mobile games. Performance-wise, the game definitely has some issues. On the PS4 Pro, you can choose between 4K 30fps and 1080p with a target 60fps. While I do like higher frame rates, I chose to stick with 4K as the 1080-60 version is incredibly blurry and visually less appealing. In 4K, the game looks quite clear, with improved details and a massive increase in resolution. All of that being said, both modes contain some pretty bad frame rate issues. The 60fps version suffered even more from this, constantly dropping during gameplay and becoming very distracting. Frame rate hits some really low numbers when you're fighting large groups of enemies in the 4K mode, but it didn't occur as often and wasn't as noticeable as a result. All in all, the game definitely feels like it could have used a lot more time in development to not only improve the content in the game, but iron out all of the performance issues that are present at launch. It feels as if the game was almost intentionally made for next gen, even if its graphics and visual style don't resemble that. Marvel's Avengers is a game I walked into with very low expectations. Along the way, I was happy to see that the game's story contained a welcomed amount of heart and some decent character moments. The combat had more to it than I initially expected, and at times, I found myself having a lot of fun. It's just a shame that a lot of this goes to waste when the game feels as if it drops the story and switches its attention over to its poorly designed and repetitive online missions. It devolves into a looting grindfest that is lacking all of the promising elements present earlier. It feels like it definitely needed more time in the oven before being released, as I found quite a few immersion-breaking glitches and pop-in textures along the way. In the end, I left having played a fairly average game. And while I didn't particularly hate it, I feel mostly underwhelmed, as there were many promising aspects that laid the groundwork for a really solid Avengers game, but instead, they wasted this potential in favor of microtransactions and multiplayer, giving us a bland and forgettable Avengers game.
This game's development process was so friggin' rushed. The developers, or whoever, the animators, were so lazy that they literally just took the exact same image and put it in this building twice. So the hallway doesn't even line up. It makes absolutely no sense. This is just, like, so hilarious.